Hello everyone. Today's screencast is about two things which are important in report writing. Now, in my job in Dubai English Speaking College, I'm teaching the extended project qualification, a 5,000 word dissertation. But for those of you going on to university, being able to write an abstract and being able to use appendices are also extremely important, especially if you do a unit which comprises a dissertation, which would be a longer piece of writing. And what I'm going to tell you today pertains to nearly every subject in which you have to write a dissertation, okay? So what is an abstract? You may write an abstract for various reasons. The two most important ones are for selection and for indexing. Abstracts allow readers who may not be interested in your work to quickly decide whether it is actually relevant to them or not. Now, many of you in your research will find abstracts extremely useful because you'll go to databases like EBSCO or JSTOR or even Google Scholar. And the abstract is the first piece of writing, and it will allow you to quickly make the decision as to whether this academic paper is going to be of interest and relevance to your study. So abstracts often use keywords, which allow you to screen them. And that's something you need to think about when you write your abstract. If it's going to be on epigenetics, make sure that that word is in the abstract, because people are going to be scanning for keywords. So an abstract is a self-contained, short and powerful statement that describes a larger work, okay? Now, there will be variations according to the discipline, and I'll only be able to touch on these in this particular screencast. That's something that you'll have to learn about in your particular university. An abstract of social science work may contain the scope, purpose, results, and contents of the work, for example. An abstract of a humanities work may contain the thesis, background, and also the conclusion of the larger work. So an abstract is not a review, and it doesn't evaluate the work. It contains keywords that will help your search, as I said. It is actually an original document rather than an excerpted passage. Now, here's an excellent web link. I strongly recommend you have a look at the Writing Center for many things. They have sections on literature reviews, etc. But they have an excellent summary on the abstract there, which I have used. Now, as an overview, the majority of abstracts are informative. While they still do not critique or evaluate a work, they do describe it. A good informative abstract acts as a surrogate for the work itself, okay? That is, the writer presents and explains all the main arguments, but in a highly condensed form. An informative abstract includes the information that can be found in a descriptive abstract, so purpose, methods, and scope, but also includes the results and conclusions of the research. And this distinction between the descriptive and the informative abstract can be seen here. So in a descriptive abstract, you will have the background, the research question to establish the purpose, the particular interest, the field of the paper, and an overview of contents. What we call an informative abstract is the same, apart from it will have the methods used, as well as the results and findings and the conclusion. So the distinction between the descriptive and informative abstract really comes down to the fact that the informative gives you the results of the study. And in many ways, that can really help you, because if you're looking for particular results, then an informative abstract will guide you to the appropriate papers to choose. So, in terms of the contents then, just to reiterate, a brief description of your methodology, the procedures you use to draft the thesis statement of your main topic, the main argument, conveying the thesis's objectives and purposes, an overview of critical discovery, arguments, or prior research, a summary of your conclusion if it is a, just to remind you, informative abstract, Although it may appear at the very start of your document, it should be the last thing that you write. And that's absolutely key. You have to write the conclusion and know exactly what the paper is about, and then go back and write the abstract. Now, the abstract might seem like a short, easy little thing to write, but it's not. Because the key thing about the abstract is it will strip all the meat off and just give you the bare bones of the argument. And it can be very challenging because the word limit for abstracts runs from 150 usually to 250 words. So if you've written 5,000 words, summarizing the purpose, methods, and conclusions is an extremely challenging thing to do, and it is an art form. Now let's have a quick little look at an example here. This I've taken from this site. You can follow it here if you're interested in finding out. And I'm going to read it out to you. The growing economic resemblance of spouses has contributed to rising inequality by increasing the number of couples in which there are too high or too low earning partners. So the first sentence, as you can see here, introduces the topic. This sentence also implies the question underlying the research. What are the various causes and the interrelationships among them for this trend? And then it speaks about the research in the past. The dominant explanation for this trend is increased assortative mating. Previous research has primarily relied on cross-sectional data and thus has been unable to disentangle changes in assortative mating from changes in the division of spouses' paid labor, a potentially key mechanism given the dramatic rise in wives' labor supply. So you see here, this shows what the previous research has been. And in an abstract, usually you show why your research is going to address a new area, what we could call a gap in knowledge. And now this goes into the methods used. We use data from the panel study of income dynamics to decompose the increase in the correlation between spouses' earnings and its contribution to inequality between 1970 and 2013. So the abstract once again very clearly shows what is the historical era that is going to be researched in addition to the methods that will be employed. Contrary to what has often been assumed, the rise of economic hegemony and its contribution to inequality is largely attributable to change in the division of paid labor, rather than changes in sorting on earnings or earnings potential. Our findings indicate that the rise of economic hegemony cannot be explained by hypotheses centered on meeting and matching opportunities, and they show where in this process inequality is generated and where it is not. So in this case, we see that this is an informative abstract. It includes the findings and it has a conclusion element to it. So we see that even though it's a very short statement, it's introduced the topic with the research sentence. It said something about the previous research. It showed how the methods are going to be different, addressing a gap in knowledge. And it's given us some indication of the findings and the conclusion of the paper. So that illustrates to you how an abstract works. Extremely condensed, no fat on it whatsoever, and it's there specifically to tell readers whether this paper is going to be very interesting to them. And I want to highlight another thing. Given that you will find abstracts by searchers, you want to make sure that you have your key terms in there. Things like panel study of income dynamics here, etc. The homogamy, which I find so hard to pronounce, etc. So think very carefully about that. I'm now going to be relying on the EPQ Toolkit for AQA, which is written by Flanagan and McGee. And in particular, if you have this textbook, you can refer to pages 88 and 89 because they will be very useful for you. I'm also going to be looking at examples of abstracts written by students in my school. And here is one now. This was an abstract for nanotechnology and cancer treatment. Nanotechnology is a multidisciplinary field which covers a vast and diverse array of devices derived from engineering, biology, physics, and chemistry. These devices include nanovectors for the targeted delivery of anti-cancer drugs and imaging contrast agents. Nanowires and nanoclevator arrays are among the leading approaches under development for the early detection of precancerous and malignant lesions from biological fluid. These and other nano devices can provide essential breakthroughs in the fight against cancer. Now, there are good and bad things about this abstract. It's very effective in terms of laying out what the paper is going to be about. However, I think it would have been very useful to have added a number of things that we saw here, perhaps identifying where if there was a gap in knowledge, and also some indication of the methods that would have been used. So we see that this in some ways is a very effective abstract, but I think it could have contained some other things. Now, based on the textbook once again over here, we have a useful checklist for you in the writing of abstracts. We begin with the aim or the hypothesis. This can be a stated aim. For instance, in this project, I intend to investigate the impact of. Or it might be a hypothesis. I intend to investigate the hypothesis that. You would usually have some indication of the literature background. Provide a very brief overview of how your topic relates to previous research. Is it building on it? Is it contesting it? Do you feel that there's a big gap, etc., in the literature? Your method. My research used a variety of materials such as journal articles and official statistics. If you're using primary data, you would specify what that primary data was. If you're only using a literature review, you don't need to say I'm writing a literature review, but you could say the literature thus far, or the majority of literature suggests that, etc. The findings. Provide the results of your investigation if appropriate. And you would use a phrase like this study indicates that. So if we go back to the this particular one here, these and other nano can provide essential breakthroughs, and it does give a sense of the findings, but it would be perhaps nice to have a little more than that. Here is an abstract again taken from the textbook. This project examines whether the Yellowstone caldera is likely to erupt in our lifetime and what the impacts of such an eruption would be on the planet. This student chooses to use the first person. I hope to examine previous eruptions and analyze their efforts on civilization at the time. I will use secondary research and data to collect information such as peer-reviewed articles and also websites such as the USGS or the Geographical Center. Now that's a very well-written introduction. My own preference is not to use first-person pronouns. I think that that's just an academic convention, and I would prefer the phrase the researcher or this research. The findings that Huckleberry Ridge Tuff was created over 2 or 3 eruptions separated by about 6,000 years leads me to conclude that the possible impact of the eruption of Yellowstone is likely to be less dramatic than the eruption of Toba 34,000 years ago. The discovery that there are less quantities of sulfurous gases in the magma encased beneath Yellowstone also helps me to determine that the prediction of a global cooling and dimming of the Earth for a period of 7 years will not be as severe as predicted. Although there will be major losses and devastation to agriculture and the civilization of the United States, the eruption will most likely not produce a major population bottleneck or extinction, as the technological advances of the human race allow planning to be undertaken to mitigate the effects of such an eruption. It's extremely clear in terms of the findings. So I think that that is why this particular abstract has been chosen by the editors of the textbook. You know exactly what this paper is going to argue, and it then allows you to decide whether it's relevant to your research or not. moving on. This is an exercise for you to do. So I'm not going to read this one out for you. I suggest what you do now is you pause the screencast and you make sure that you are able to identify the aim or the hypothesis, the background research, the methods, the results, and the conclusions. And we suggest you use different colors to highlight this. So if you could do that now. Now, I hope you found that a useful exercise because it breaks down the main components of a well-written abstract. This abstract here is about 250 words. It's about the size of an abstract that would be for a dissertation or an EPQ of about 5,000 words. I now have another exercise for you to do. So I would like you to read this abstract over here. You will see when you read it that it's missing a number of things. I would like you to pause the screencast once again and please make a note of what you believe is missing from this abstract, and you could put a couple of notes down on how to improve it. If you could do that now, please. Now, in a third example, we're looking at a desk student's abstract, and this was for a medical EPQ. I'm going to read it to you now, and I'm going to give you some time to reflect and think about it. Personalized medicine is a movement away from the one-size-fits-all approach to the treatment and care of patients. One of its promised benefits is a positive impact on the disease screening and prevention, as well as the development of targeted therapies for each patient and their specific disease. This article focuses on the prevention and treatment of melanoma based on the individual genetic mutations present. As melanoma is considered one of the most aggressive and treatment-resistant human cancers, it is increasing to see the development in therapies available, as there have previously not been any treatments for late-stage melanoma. Also included is the evaluation of the possibility of implementing this concept into the NHS for the widespread use of the UK. Now, if you could analyze that, and I will begin. Now, I'm hoping that most of you found that a well-shaped and well-crafted abstract. It is extremely economical, and I think it's a very good example of what can be achieved when you cut away anything that is unnecessary, because there is actually a lot of detail in this short abstract. You will, of course, recognize the fact that it is not an informative abstract, because it does not give you an indication of all the results and findings and the conclusion. It focuses instead on what the paper is going to be about, and it's descriptive in so much as it provides you with an overview of the contents. Now let's have a look at another abstract written by a desk student. This was an EPQ on migrants in Greece, and it asked the question, benefit or burden? So this particular project looks at the recent influx in refugees throughout the world, particularly Europe, and evaluates whether they present a burden or a benefit in societies today. The goal is to develop how, despite common misconception, refugees do not only pose a threat to host communities, but also instead offer skills and social pressure that positively affects governments. This has been done by analyzing pre-existing literature on migration in countries like Germany and Finland post-World War II, as well as Kenya after the crisis in Somalia. Furthermore, the impacts of these refugees will be further explained using the case study of Greece. This case study will focus on the effects refugees have had, particularly on the healthcare system within the country. Upon examination of these events, this research highlights how refugees are not just deviants of society, but instead, if socially integrated effectively, can play a key role within nations. Now, I think you'll recognize that this is an example of an informative conclusion. It doesn't give you a great deal of information, but it does give you an indication of the results and the conclusion of the paper. So there we have two different examples, one of them being the descriptive abstract, one of them being the informative abstract. There is no rule within the extended project, for instance, on which abstract you use. When you go to university, it'll be very important, as I said at the beginning of this screencast, it's very dependent upon the discipline that you will be studying. Whether it's your humanities one, and in the humanities and social sciences, you tend to use informative ones more. Here's one last one that we'll be looking at. This is a paper on the justification for the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki have been subject to much historical criticism within traditionalist viewpoints, presenting the use of atomic weaponry on Imperial Japan to be justified, being challenged by revisionists who claim that it was not. The aim of this paper is to assess the Truman administration's use of atomic weaponry and gauge the justifiability of such action. To conduct this assessment, the Pacific War is looked at in the entirety, encompassing the events of the conflict as well as the Japanese as a military adversary. This is done to gain critical context needed to judge the justifiability of atomic bombs. Following this, the alternative options to the use of atomic bombs are presented and evaluated, chiefly a conditional surrender, continued naval blockade, and aerial bombardment, the further involvement of the USSR, and the planned invasion of mainland Japan. Succeeding these alternatives is a critical analysis of the legality of the atomic bombs placed within the international humanitarian law of the time. Within the final concluded analysis, it is determined that the use of atomic weaponry on Imperial Japan was justified when it is taken into account, the historical context is taken into account. Alternatives to their use and their pressures facing the leaders at the time. Now, it's a very interesting abstract. My feeling is that it has some excellent information in there, but perhaps some of this detail could have been reserved for the introduction. You'll notice that this particular abstract here is able to achieve a very thorough descriptive account of the research in very few words. This has perhaps placed an excessive amount of detail in concerning the exact arguments that will take place. So I would be under the opinion, although this has some merits to it, there would be an opportunity of perhaps reducing some of that content. And now, these are 3 excellent websites that I would strongly suggest you look at if you want further details concerning abstracts. I'm going to now move on to the issue of the appendices. Now, in the EPQ, it's strongly advised that you use appendices because they are able to show some of the hidden research that may not be apparent in your report. They are also used extensively at university when you do any kind of research, because sometimes there's far too much volume and depth in your research to include in the actual paper, but at the same time you don't want that research to become invisible. So I strongly advise you to find out about the use of appendices in whichever disciplines you go on to study in at university. So, what would go into the appendices? Items that the reader would want to see or find useful. These are things that would often disrupt the flow of the essay because of excessive detail. One example, recently I had an excellent study by a girl who looked into the idea of third culture kids in our school in DESC. And she did she gained a lot of numerical data through surveys and questionnaires. Now, a lot of that data was very useful to show the thickness and depth of the research, but when she put it into the essay, it kind of ruined the flow of the essay. And the way that we compromised was we put it into the appendices, so it was still visible, but the actual essay read better without the unnecessarily depth and all of the figures. Of course, the appendices need to be referenced within the main body of the essay. So in the middle of the report you write, as seen in Appendices 2, or refer to Appendices 2, or a detailed analysis of the data appears in Appendices 4, for example. So you do refer to it. And some further advice. Do not go overboard and produce excessive material. Sometimes students might put on 50 or 100 pages. Well, no one's going to look at that, okay? It should impress but not annoy your examiner or marker, and it should be useful stuff. So there is an element of selection even in appendices. You can't just bung in everything at the back and hope for the best. It should help you in terms of assessment by showing the depth of your research, okay? So that's what I say about making your research visible to the marker. So possible appendices might be things like standardized instructions, raw data from surveys, etc., consent forms if you've done any human research, a plain language statement, again, that you've given to your subjects if you've conducted a human research study, explanations of formulations for data analysis, especially if it is extremely technical, copies of questionnaires, transcripts of interviews, specialized computer programs for specific procedures, especially if you've done artifacts, etc., full generic names of chemicals, diagrams of specialized apparatuses or processes, photographs of artifact construction. You obviously would put some of those at your report, but you might want to put if you want a full kind of history of the construction of an artifact, you may have separate appendices showing this. Musical scores, early sketches, a shot list, storyboards, etc. So there's a whole variety of things that you want to put into them. And as I say, one of the key things would be to make a reference in the report to them, to direct the reader's attention to them in the event that they're looking for that level of detail. Now, this is specific to the EPQ using the production log. So if you are completing an EPQ, we don't want you to duplicate the information all of the time, okay? So in the production log, perhaps don't say too much about things, but you can also refer to the appendices and say, you know, a full account of my research is found in the appendices following the report. And I think that that's my main message from the screencast is, at their best, appendices make the depth, the thickness, and the complexity of the research visible. It may be in the report that you simplify your findings for the benefits of your readership, and the appendices then gives the complexity, a greater complex picture. And in terms, again, specific to the EPQ, AO3, which is about develop and realize, the appendices are especially important because they're an opportunity to show problem solving, decision making, and the selection of materials. I found some excellent YouTube videos that will help you. The first one is an effective overview of abstract writing. There's some very good examples of abstracts on this particular link here. This link is very good if you're looking to go beyond sixth form study to look at honours and masters research. And as I say here, this is presented by quite an annoying, nerdy guy, but it shows you many common mistakes in abstract writing, and it is of use as well. Now, to sum up what we've covered today, abstracts help the reader to gain a sense of the content, purpose, and findings in your research. The abstract appears before the table of contents. It is not, strictly speaking, part of the research paper. And in terms of something like the EPQ, you put it before the table of contents because you don't want it to be part of the word count. It is not an introduction. Remember that. It is separate from an introduction. And we've seen perhaps in one of the abstracts earlier, too much of the information of an introduction perhaps appeared in the abstract. It's very useful in terms of saving the reader time. Remember that the appendices show the depth of your research, okay? And it is good practice to refer to them in the main body of the written report so that you draw your reader's attention to them. I hope you found that useful. Good luck in your future research. Thank you for listening.